Welcome back, America. Hugh Hewitt. I promised you all morning that I would begin a 10-part series in the week before an election with a sitting United States Senator who's not up for election. And the reason is because this book, Only the Strong, is probably the most important national security book put out by a sitting elected official since I have been doing this show. And Senator Tom Cotton joins me. He's the author of Only the Strong. Good morning, Senator. Thank you for this. Congratulations on the launch of a book. People have asked me why I am doing 10 parts on one book in the week before an election, and it is my obvious attempt to put national security on the table. Is that why you released Only the Strong during an election week?
Well, thanks, Hugh, for having me on and talking about Only the Strong. Yeah, I did want to release my new book, Only the Strong, before the election, in part to outline the stakes of the election. As I describe in the book, many Americans feel like America has been in decline under Joe Biden and before him, Barack Obama. And I tell the inside story about why this isn't an accident, why it's not just Joe Biden's bad luck. This is decline by design, that Democrats going back 100 years have been undermining the sources of American power, not only our military, but also energy production, our southern border, and the sovereignty of our nation. They've been coddling our adversaries like China and Russia. And they're doing these things on purpose, as I explain in Only the Strong. And the stakes of this election is that if you think America's been in decline, if you want to reverse it, if you want to restore American power, I have a roadmap here that we can once we take back the Congress in this election and hopefully the White House in the next election.
Now, Senator, you've got two small children. You're married up. You got two small children. I have five grandchildren. We are sleepwalking towards a catastrophe. And I say that having lived through the Carter years and watching that catastrophic sequence of events beginning with the Iranian Revolution. But I've also been listening to Churchill's The World Crisis, and Great Britain sleepwalked into World War I, ignoring what was going on in the world. That was not driven by an ideological blindness, but by arrogance. We're being driven by ideology. That's the catastrophic moment we're in. We are trapped by an ideology of the left into ignoring what is going on in the world. Do you think we can break out of this in time?
I do think we can, Hugh, because the American people are not really ideological. Even those kind of center-left Americans who normally vote Democratic are not ideologues in the way that Barack Obama was an ideologue and that his understudy Joe Biden has followed in his footsteps. Or ideologues going back to Woodrow Wilson, as I explain in Only the Strong, really the fountainhead of American leftist thinking, especially in the Democratic Party. And in particular, when it comes to our safety in the world, the American people are the opposite of ideologues. They are usually clear-eyed, hard-nosed about America's interest, and they want leaders to do the same, to put them and their interest first.
Now, I've talked to you frequently about what happens if the Senate majority and the House majority become Republican and whether or not we can buttress America's defenses in time against Xi and other enemies, including Iran and many other internal enemies having to do with terrorism and things like that. But first, we got to win. First, we got to win. So I want to do politics, then go through every chapter and Only the Strong. We can't do the whole book, but I can give people a taste. How do you feel about the election on 11/8?
We're going to win next week, Hugh. I don't have any question in my mind. We're going to take back the House. I think we're going to take back the Senate as well. I think we may even win in some surprising races. And the Democrats are currently right now trying to shore up even places like Washington State, where Chuck Schumer is spending millions of dollars at the last minute to prop up Patty Murray, a 30-year failed career politician, against Tiffany Smiley, herself a great American patriot who stood by her husband, Scotty Smiley, when he was wounded in Iraq and stood up for our troops and our veterans, demanding better care for them. We've got great candidates like Tiffany all across the country. That's why we're going to win a majority. We can't turn everything around as long as Joe Biden is president, but we can begin to stop the decline. As I explained in Only the Strong, we can do things like begin to rebuild our military, begin to restore America's energy dominance, attend to our wide open southern border. It'll take a new president to fully reverse it, but we can start it next week with a big smashing victory.
Now, every single time I bring you on, people know I've known you for a long time, and most people who listen to the show know your story. But I want people to understand you grew up in Arkansas, you went to Harvard undergraduate, you went to Harvard Law School, 9/11 happened. You paid off your student loans by working. Off into the Army you went, but you didn't want to be a JAG. You insisted on becoming a fighting soldier. You went to Ranger School. You became a member of the 101st, combat tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. a tour in the old guard. Have led a serious life. You've written a serious book. You're a serious person with a very wry sense of humor. But what do warriors see and hear differently when they're actually deployed from what people like me who sit in studios and pontificate hear and see? And I'm speaking specifically about when you were in Iraq and listening to President Obama.
Well, Hugh, in my experience in both Iraq and Afghanistan, obviously the aperture of one's vision is somewhat narrowed to the battle right in front of you because, as you say, the stakes are deadly serious. However, it's also more focused on those stakes as well. So while you might not view all the news, every up and down in the business world or local news when you're in a place like Iraq or Afghanistan, you do pay attention to what your commander-in-chief is saying or what the Secretary of Defense is saying. That goes from things like whether soldiers' pay is going to be increased, what's happening on the home front, back home at bases, and the matters of grand strategy. You know, we all knew in Iraq in 2006 that we were not winning the war, that we didn't have enough troops. And most of the troops with whom I served were hopeful that George Bush would do what he did a few months after we left, which is provide more troops with a new strategy to help us stabilize that country. Likewise, that was in Afghanistan for the first few months of the Obama presidency. And I have to say, after Obama sounded unusually strident and bellicose terms about Afghanistan and the war, it was immediately noticed by all the troops, down to frontline soldiers, that when he took office, he did not have a plan in place to immediately act upon it. So much so that we began to hear from Afghans out on our patrols or in the local market, the old Afghan proverb that you have the watches, but we have the time. Everyone could tell that Obama, despite his unusually bellicose campaign rhetoric, was beginning to look for ways to kind of back out of Afghanistan and head for the exits in those early months of 2009. And then, of course, when he took his apology tour just weeks before we left country, we were shocked by the president traveling around the world, apologizing for America, suggesting that we had to atone for supposed sins.
Now, in a unique way, as a graduate of President Obama is a Harvard Law graduate, as you are, you're carrying a rifle in a war zone. President Obama is off on the apology tour. How did that feel? Because you know that that's an ideologue. That's not a commander-in-chief. That's an ideologue spouting Ben Rhodes' written nonsense. The Metternich of MSNBC is out there feeding him lines which just doesn't match up with your reality walking point.
Yeah, well, as I say in Only the Strong, Barack Obama was the most ideological president since Woodrow Wilson. He's an example of what Gene Kirkpatrick famously said about the Democrats, the Blame America First Democrat, and we took that tour in the winter and spring of 2009. He continued to apologize for what he viewed as America's sins. Remember, it was on the apology tour when he denigrated American exceptionalism, which most Americans hold dear, saying it was no different from Greeks thinking Greece is exceptional or the British thinking Great Britain is exceptional, which is really Obama's way of saying that it's just kind of an outdated and obsolete chauvinism for one's own, that we should really all transcend our petty patriotism and become what Obama declared himself in the 2008 campaign, a citizen of the world. So it makes a certain sense that he would go on that kind of apology tour because he is deeply hostile to American power and America's unique leadership role in the world. In fact, he said, as I explained in Only the Strong, that no world order should elevate one nation above the other. Most Americans, again, are not ideological, and they believe that it's been a very good thing to have a United States-led order that does indeed elevate the United States above all other nations. That's why we used to take pride in the term leader of the free world for the American president.
When we come back and continue our conversation with Senator Tom Cotton about his brand new bestseller, Only the Strong, we will talk about the consequences of that apology tour. Stay tuned to this show. You'll hear the next part of my conversation with Senator Cotton. All right, Senator, 3, 2, 1.
Can we pause
Back now with Senator Tom Cotton, continuing my long conversation about Only the Strong. I sat down last week with Senator Cotton and did something I haven't done in 23 years of a radio show. Take 10 segments on one book. Why? Because national security matters more than anything else. It's hard to get people to pay attention, especially in a week before an election, but we've got to. And I want to pay attention to a concert in Medellin. I'll remember a lot about Only the Strong, but that's a great anecdote. And what I was touched by is your remark that these are the greatest patriots we have. The men and women who go abroad that don't get much in the way of entertainment. I thought of Gary Sinise and John Andrazik and the great men and women who go and show up for a day or 2 days and provide a little. These people are everywhere around the country, the world, and we forget about them, Senator. And you wanted to make sure in Only the Strong that we don't forget that at this moment, under the sea, in the skies, around the world, American patriots are serving in uniform.
Yeah, Hugh, I started Only the Strong with a short story about my time in Afghanistan. We were out in a very small patrol base in Medarlam in Loghman Province in eastern Afghanistan. Typically, when you have USO tours, they stick to the big bases that are easier to secure, places like Bagram and Kandahar. But we had a band from Illinois called the Matt Toss Band come in and join us in May of 2009. It was pretty hot when they were playing out on our outdoor basketball court. But you could tell the troops, even though necessarily their music taste didn't run to that style, they really appreciated the musicians who came out to honor our troops, just like we appreciate people like Gary Sinise and John Andrazik. When we have almost 200,000 of our fellow Americans spread all around the world manning the distant ramparts to keep the ravages of war away from our shores, we should always remember them, hold them fast, keep them in our prayers, and most importantly, provide them with the support and the resources and the weapons and the training they need to defend ourselves, to defend our nation and keep themselves safe.
It is a terrific way to begin the book, and then it's like a rocket to the right jaw when you say, quote, in Barack Obama's second term, when this occurred, American power crumbled. And it did. And it did for reasons that are lasting and to our detriment. Does anyone honestly assess how bad President Obama, until Only the Strong, how bad? Maybe Robert Gates, but anyone honestly stepped up and said how bad he was for the country?
Bob Gates is pretty tough in his memoir about it, but remember that memoir was written in 2013, published in 2014. You really have to look back on Obama's tenure to see how ruinous it was for our nation. But I have to tell you, Hugh, I don't think you would get that assessment from Barack Obama or John Kerry or any of the aides in his White House who helped design his foreign policy. In fact, I think he would, like an American Ozymandias, tell Americans to look upon his works in despair. One point I make in Only the Strong is Barack Obama's failures are not incompetence. They're not naivete. They're not inexperience. They are exactly what he intended. He came into office as the most ideological president since Woodrow Wilson. He wanted to lay American power low, and at every turn, he was ruthless about doing that. Just recently, for
and
instance,
effective. And effective.
Yeah, very effective in pursuing this ideological agenda. You know, recently, because of the protests in Iran, he reflected on his failure to step forth and support the Green Revolution protest movement in the summer of 2009. He said that he regretted that. Hugh, I don't believe it for a moment. As I explained in Only the Strong, he had a very careful, thoroughly worked out plot to achieve a nuclear deal with Iran that was about much more than just their nuclear program. It was about atoning what he viewed as our sins against Iran, going back to the 1950s when he falsely, wrongly believed that we somehow overthrew a democratically elected government. And the reason he stood by in 2009, when you had the largest uprising in Iran since the revolution itself in 1979, again, he wasn't caught flat-footed, he wasn't naive, he wasn't inexperienced, he wasn't new to the job, he was ruthless in pursuing his rapprochement with the Ayatollahs, and he was under...
You know, I was late to this recognition. I was one of the people who thought he was just an incompetent person who had Peter Principled up to the presidency by mistake. You have persuaded me. Quote, and I'm quoting from Tom Cotton's new book, The Senator's Written Only the Strong, America's recent decline isn't an accident, it's decline by design. Now, I want to very quickly say, Senator Cotton is not accusing anyone of treason. He's not accusing anyone of trying to destroy America from within. There's no fifth column. It's an ideological view of the world that views American power as bad for the world. And Senator, I want to just give you 2 minutes before we move on to the next slide. Explain to people this ideological view. They don't hate America. They hate American power. They're very different things.
Well, Hugh, as I write in Only the Strong, they don't necessarily hate America. They aren't necessarily un-American, though a lot of them are, frankly. One thing, though, that is true of the Democratic Party almost uniformly going back to the 60s and the 70s is that they are, at best, at best, ambivalent about America,
Yes.
and certainly hostile to American power. And they think not only the world, but America itself would be a better place if we would atone for our sins, if we would pull in our horns, if we would become something more like a normal nation, as opposed to the exceptional nation that most Americans grew up believing in and still want America to be. Not only for the world, but first and foremost for ourselves, for our own safety, for our own freedom, for our own prosperity. And that is just alien to the way Democrats think. I mean, I defy you to name a single Democrat over the last 50 years who has been unabashedly, unashamedly proud of America in the way that Ronald Reagan was in his rhetoric about our country and our history and our future.
Anyone who takes up that challenge will not be able to meet it. Tomorrow we will continue with our conversation with Senator Cotton about his brand new book, Only the Strong, as we get into the heart of it and the ideological soul of the left when it comes to American power. Go to Amazon.com right now, get Only the Strong, buy a bunch of copies, give them to your friends, get smart. National security matters. It especially matters next Tuesday. Thank you, Senator. We'll talk to you tomorrow.
Thank you, Hugh.
Okay, take a second here, Tom. I got to, thank goodness that didn't happen when we were talking. Okay, 3, 2, 1. Back now for part 3 of my long series of interviews with Senator Tom Cotton about his brand new book, Only the Strong, putting national security on the table in the week before the election in a way that I have not seen anyone do since Richard Nixon in 1980 put out The Real War to buttress Ronald Reagan's campaign against Jimmy Carter. In that way, Senator Cotton has put out Only the Strong to buttress every Republican out there because we need to focus on national security, even as inflation is crushing us, education is collapsing around us, the border is open, we'll come to the border. Senator, it's painful to talk about, but we have to talk about the collapse in Afghanistan a year ago because no one in the mainstream media is. Legacy media has abandoned the issue. We've condemned a country to darkness. We didn't have to do so. Mike Pompeo has told me, you've confirmed, we were planning to leave 2,500 troops there. It didn't have to happen. Was that incompetence? Was that design? Was that Joe Biden just living off the fumes of the Obama presidency?
Well, I think the way Afghanistan collapsed last summer was a combination of Joe Biden's rank incompetence and his deep insecurity. As I explained in Only the Strong, drawing upon some memoirs at the time by people like Secretary of Defense Bob Gates, Joe Biden in 2009 subjected Barack Obama to what Bob Gates called Chinese water torture over Afghanistan. And he poisoned the well between Obama and our military leaders, constantly accusing them of being misleading, of leaking to the press, of undermining President Obama in a way that Bob Gates said he never saw under George W. Bush. May have disagreed, may have seen disagreements between senior military leaders and President Bush, but no mistrust. That's pretty common for Democrats and the military, though. But for 13 years, Joe Biden believed that he was right about Afghanistan, and everyone, including Barack Obama, was wrong, and he had a chip on his shoulder. And he wanted to show everyone in 2021 that he had been right all along. And that's why he disregarded the best military advice of our commander in Afghanistan, our commander in the Middle East, our chairman of the Joint Chiefs, his own Secretary of Defense, frankly, most of his own civilian advisors in the White House and the State Department. He wanted to show that he was right and had been all along. And he wouldn't listen to the obvious facts about what led to the collapse in Afghanistan so precipitously. I mean, just 5 weeks before Kabul fell, he was saying there'd be no Saigon-like collapse. And this is now, as I explained in Only the Strong, the Afghan effect is going to be as bad as the Vietnam effect was, for at least as long as Joe Biden is president.
Let's stay there for a moment. The Afghan effect has a knock-on effect, which we've seen in Ukraine. Are we going to see it in Taiwan? How do we arrest the dictators of the world from concluding that President Biden is simply incompetent and infirm and unable to stop their every move?
Well, I explained in Only the Strong, it was just a few weeks after we left Afghanistan that Vladimir Putin began to marshal forces on Ukraine's border. I think that President Biden's weakness in Afghanistan, combined with his appeasement all last year of Vladimir Putin on various matters like a nuclear arms control treaty and the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, the Colonial Pipeline hack, enticed Putin, if you will. It tempted him, gave what Churchill called temptations to a trial of strength. Now, the war in Ukraine hasn't turned out the way he expected, but it should have never been tempted in the first place. I hope that won't be the case with Taiwan. But frankly, now that Xi Jinping has achieved an unprecedented third term, he's stacked the Politburo with his own allies. I worry very much that he may, like Vladimir Putin did with Ukraine, see a closing window of opportunity while Joe Biden is president to go for the jugular in Taiwan. The best thing we can do, and what a new Republican Congress will do, I hope, is increase our defense budget, invest particularly in the kinds of weapons, especially missiles and munitions, submarines, drones that we need to support Taiwan, and that we get Taiwan the weapons it needs right now, that we don't wait until a war begins the way Joe Biden did in Ukraine.
Senator, you serve on armed services, you serve on intel, you're on judiciary. Do we have enough time? The sleepwalking into this crisis is so far advanced. We saw how long it took to get a HIMARS to Ukraine. I mean, this was not even the commitment of American troops, much less a direct confrontation with a superpower, though, of course, Putin has nuclear weapons. It took forever to get that, and now we're out of ammunition. Do we have enough time, even if the landslide comes and you lead an American strength movement in the Senate and you have counterparts in the House, do we have enough time?
Well, in Taiwan, as I explained, only the strong, the hour is late, but it's not yet expired. Most of what Taiwan needs, it's not stealth fighters, it's not aircraft carriers, it's relatively straightforward missiles and munitions or sea mines for the Taiwan Strait. These are things that take way too long to build right now. But again, they're not on the scale of an aircraft or a ship. And if we invest the money now to increase the rates of production for the missiles and other weapons that we sell to Taiwan, I think we can get into their hands what they need to defend themselves. We also have to be more straightforward and clear that we will come to Taiwan's defense. Unfortunately, as I explained in Only the Strong, Joe Biden 3 times in 9 months said we would come to Taiwan's defense, only to have his White House aides anonymously walk it back and say he didn't mean to change our policy. That gets the worst of all worlds, Hugh. You get provocation without deterrence. Now, one of the challenges of writing a book that's partly about current events is that it can be overtaken by events. In Only the Strong, I said he did it 3 times in 9 months. He has since done it again. So now it's 4 times in 13 months. What he needs to do is...
Your book has not been overtaken by event. I want everyone to understand, though, Only the Strong is about as timely a warning on national security as I have ever read from an elected official. When we come back, we're going to get into the deep ideological problem here, because the most important part about Only the Strong is not our crisis. We can talk about our crisis every day. It's where did it come from? And we'll talk about that in the next segment later in the show today. Stay tuned for more of Senator Cotton. Okay, this is a little bit longer, Senator. This one's going to be about 10 minutes. And deep ideological roots here. All right, 3, 2, 1. Back now with United States Senator Tom Cotton, his brand new bestseller, Only the Strong, in bookstores everywhere, Amazon.com. And I've set aside a longer segment right here because the ideological roots of the book is about, well, there's a lot of Hegel in history, there's a lot of Lincoln and the founders, there's a lot of Woodrow Wilson, and finally someone has explained it. Now, Jonah Goldberg has tried a few times. Fine writer, friend of the show. No, he's a friend of yours. He's tried a few times in big books that only people like me read to explain where this came from. You went back and tried to do it again. Would you explain to people why you think it's important that they get what Wilson was and why it matters today, and why the framers, Lincoln and Reagan, are different from that?
Well, Hugh, I think it's important to understand the ideological roots of the decline Americans see all around them. As I said, Barack Obama is the most ideological president since Wilson. Now, Barack Obama was very careful, though, to mask his ideology. Sometimes he let the mask slip, like, for instance, when he was attending Jeremiah Wright's church for all those years. Jeremiah Wright, remember, the infamous pastor who said 9/11 was America's chickens coming home to roost, that God wouldn't bless America, but rather damn America. This is not some passing relationship. I mean, Barack Obama saw down his church, sat in his pews for years, even had him officiate his wedding to Michelle Obama. Or when Barack Obama said that America wasn't an exceptional nation. When he said we were going to fundamentally transform America, Hugh. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't know many people who think that if you love something, you should want to fundamentally transform it. I can't imagine the fetching Mrs. Hewitt would take too well if you said, honey, I love you, but I want to fundamentally transform you. With Obama, though, it's somewhat rare that that ideological mask slips. With Wilson, you see it out in the open. The first the first president who was openly hostile and opposed to our Declaration of Independence and our Constitution. He said they were outdated, they were obsolete, they belonged to a Newtonian age of checks and balances, not a Darwinian age of evolution. He said that the moral basis of our nation, the natural equality of mankind, that none of us, as Jefferson said, are born with saddles on our backs to be ridden or spurs on our heels to ride, was outdated as well. He had this conception of history with a capital H, that it was evolving and therefore mankind could be perfectible, that we could have heaven on earth, that we could achieve utopia. The founders knew that this was all nonsense. They understood, as Madison said in the Federalist Papers, that government is the greatest of all reflections on human nature. And our nature is that we're fallen creatures. We are the creatures that are between the animals and between God. We're capable of self-government, we're capable of reason, but there are also parts of our nature that require more circumspection. That's why we have law enforcement and prosecutors and prisons. That's why we have a military. That's why you have a lock on your front door. They understood that you couldn't build America's foreign policy on utopian foundations. And moreover, what you see as time evolves, after Woodrow Wilson and the progressives had repudiated the moral basis of our founding and our nation, it wasn't a very far step to the 60s and 70s when the New Left repudiated America itself.
Did this Hegelian mirage, is it conscious in your opinion on the left today, or is it inherited? Is it just simply a reflex muscle memory, or do they sometimes President Obama, people like that come along and you believe they're ideologues, but let's just take your average senator you're sitting next to in the United States Senate. Do they have any idea who Hegel is, or do they think that's a bagel factory?
No, I don't think so, Hugh. I mean, I think there are a few self-conscious ideologues like Barack Obama who do. I mean, they're like Wilson, very much understood the project he was undertaking. It was as much a project at home as it was abroad. You know, Woodrow Wilson had this idea that we had overcome the need for separation of powers, checks and balances, federalism, all these protections built on the nature of man as described in the Federalist Papers, that you have to have a degree of circumspection and care before granting power to anyone, and that you cannot grant them unchecked power. Wilson thought that was so much nonsense. That's why he wanted to run roughshod over the Constitution, create this alphabet soup of agencies we have today. It was his idea that you're going to have some, elite, disinterested, scientific core of experts to tinker and administer and engineer society, as opposed to accountable elected officials. Now, most people today just take all those things for granted. And frankly, a lot of people on the right do as well. Whenever you hear a politician say something like the arc of history or being on the right side of history, they are echoing Woodrow Wilson and the progressives and this idea that our nation is not founded on the natural equality of mankind, on a fixed human nature that is timeless and unchanging, but some kind of historical evolutionary process in which mankind is perfectible, in which we can achieve utopia. The founders would say history doesn't have an arc. There's no such thing as the right side of history. There's the right side of decisions that individuals make in the moment. And
this is why one of the claims you put in the ground, you put a stake in the ground, is that Republicans, conservatives, and Americans generally need to understand the founding. They need to understand Lincoln. They've got to understand what Reagan was talking about. They've got to get the ideas down. Let me take a shot at some of our friends, some of your colleagues in the Senate. I don't think if you say the Federalist Papers to them, they're going to think it's a wallpaper. They're not going to know this stuff either. Why are you reaching so hard in Only the Strong to get people to get the ideas down?
Well, again, I think because of the kind of country America is. Margaret Thatcher said America was founded on ideas and philosophy, not on history, which is how Europe came into being in its modern form. It's so critical that we understand the ideas that have motivated the left for the last 100 years. Why people like Barack Obama have done what they do. It's not something that's often said, and again, it's kind of largely assumed that, of course, we would have all these unaccountable bureaucratic agencies in Washington, a deep state of left-wingers. who are pursuing their partisan agenda, far from being disinterested scientific experts as Woodrow Wilson imagined. As I explained in Only the Strong, we have to get back to the founders' understanding of our nature and the basis of our Constitution if we want to restore American power.
And last question for this segment. The left is getting further to the left. I mean, they're becoming more entrenched. If you look at the candidates on the ballot next week, Mandela Barnes in Wisconsin, John Fetterman in Pennsylvania, Raphael Warnock, your colleague in the Senate in Georgia, these are hard left. I mean, they are, Elizabeth Warren was out there already. They are not liberal. They are not liberal leftists. They are hard left. Is their party capable of stopping that tumble off of the Wilsonian edge?
Well, if they're not capable of that, the defeat they're going to receive next week is just a small foretaste of what's to come in 2024 and beyond. And you see some of the shrewder minds in the Democratic Party recognizing this, trying to get out in front of it to avoid blame, like Barack Obama in the same interview where he claimed to regret that he didn't, that he wished he had supported the Green Movement in 2009 in Iran, when in reality he failed to support it on purpose because he didn't want to deny Tolas. He also said that, you know, we can sometimes be buzzkills and scolds, that we get upset if people don't use exactly the right language. Now, again, Barack Obama is a deep and committed ideologue, but he's also a shrewd politician. What you see with a lot of the people you named is that they're deep ideologues. They're simply not shrewd politicians. They don't have the good sense to mask those sentiments during the election season.
And when we come back in the next segment, we're going to talk about emotional leftism, the deep sense of shame motivating a lot of the left. And do not miss that. Go get Only the Strong during this break and come back. We'll continue talking with Senator Cotton throughout the show, throughout the week. National security matters. Vote Republican. Which segment is this, Adam? Is this 4 or... No, this is day 3, segment 5. Okay. Welcome back, America. Senator Tom Cotton is back. His brand new book, Only the Strong, has been featured all week and will be featured all week as we run up to the election because it's an argument for America's national security. I'm begging people to read it and to believe it because we've got to rebuild American defenses. Senator, I want to fast forward from Wilson and not yet to Obama and pause at Jimmy Carter. You write on page 33 of Only the Strong about the deep sense of shame James Fallows talked about for evading the draft. I've long thought that my generation was conflicted over Vietnam. I came in after Vietnam, but that the people who skipped out on Vietnam versus my brother-in-law who fought it had a deep emotional divide they were never going to be able to overcome, and that it manifested itself in politics in an unspoken way. You articulate that. So obviously you've thought about what Carter and the Vietnam era did to us. How did that play into the Wilsonian hostility towards American exceptionalism?
Well, Wilson openly repudiated the American founding and the moral basis of our country. Once you lose that moral foundation, Hugh, as Abraham Lincoln warned about in his great speeches and letters in the 1850s and 1860s, it's not a very far slide into repudiating America itself. And that's what the New Left did in the 1960s, especially leading up to Vietnam. I think it's very important for everyone to understand that in the moment, Vietnam was not that different, not viewed that differently than our ancestors had viewed any other war. There's a sense promoted by aging boomer lefties, probably out of shame, that Vietnam was fought by a bunch of miserable conscripts. That is simply not the case, Hugh. More than 2/3 of the soldiers fighting in Vietnam were volunteers. People like my dad. He was in college, he had a deferment, he became a school teacher, he had a deferment from that as well, but he decided that wasn't for him. There was a war going on, that he was going to volunteer to do his time rather than wait around and worry about the draft. And he did. He served for a year in Vietnam. He's proud of his service. He should be, as all Vietnam veterans did. Ronald Reagan said it was a noble cause, and he was right. But you have young liberals like Jim Fallows, who was, considered, as Kennedy put it, the best and the brightest. He was at Harvard. He was a Rhodes Scholar, and he wrote as a young man about his efforts to evade the draft. It's astonishing, starving themselves, working with liberal law students from Harvard Medical, or liberal medical students from Harvard Medical School, scouring regulations, trying to find ways out of the draft, chanting for Ho Chi Minh on the way to the draft site where they were going to go through their medical testing, all celebrating when they all got registered medically disqualified, even as the doctors knew what they were under. And then Fallows wrote about another bus that came up from places like South Boston, and as he calls them, the white proles of Boston, who to him looked like lambs being led off to the slaughter. Another word for them might just be patriotic Americans, who maybe didn't want to go fight in Vietnam, maybe didn't even support the aims of the Vietnam War, but understood their country was at war and they were fulfilling their duty. And I don't think that all those aging boomer lefties have ever gotten over the shame they felt for being draft dodgers or draft evaders, and it's colored their views. It certainly hasn't impaired their prospects. I mean, Bill Clinton became president. Jim Fallows, just a year after he wrote those words, became Jimmy Carter's chief speechwriter. But it has colored their views about America and American power ever since.
Some books have an interesting confluence of events around them when they come onto my radio show. When I was reading, I had finished and I had outlined Only the Strong, was the first time I had met on the radio Hung Cao. And Hung Cao came in the United States as a refugee from Vietnam. He's a captain in the Navy, Special Forces warrior, amazing American. He received at Camp Pendleton in an operation that my brother-in-law, then a captain back from his second tour in Vietnam, was partially involved in. And my brother-in-law was at the house when I was talking to Hung Cao, and we talked about that operation. The people who fought Vietnam are still here. They're still with us in large numbers, and they're still proud of their service. But the folks who ran away from it and who have devoted their lives to denying what we were about are still here too, and they're deeply embedded in the media, Senator. I am curious about the media's reaction to Only the Strong, because you're hitting right at the heart of the people who run legacy media. It is the Vietnam generation and the people that they hired.
Yeah, I mean, Hugh, today, most of the legacy media is just a press adjunct of the Democratic Party and the progressive movement in America. As I write in Only the Strong, the media had essentially declared war in the home front. You know, you had Walter Cronkite, for instance, saying that the Tet Offensive had been a major disaster, when, in effect, our troops in Vietnam had essentially destroyed the Viet Cong, the guerrillas in South Vietnam, as a fighting force. You had the New York Times consistently leaking and trying to undermine the war effort. Leader of the Sulzberger family at the time, who owns the New York Times, saying he didn't know what America had to offer the Vietnamese that was any better than the communists. There's this progressive ideology, which again has infiltrated throughout our education establishment. Remember, Woodrow Wilson started out as a college professor before he became president, is learned and inculcated in our cultural and media and political elites. So we shouldn't be surprised that people at places like the New York Times have the exact same views as ideological politicians like Barack Obama.
You know, I know Only the Strong should be on the New York Times bestseller list. I know, given the rollout and the reception it's receiving. I don't know that it will be. They simply manipulate that. But the Amazon rankings don't lie. Go and get it. When we come back, the next time I talk with Senator Cobb, we're going to talk about Jimmy Carter in Nicaragua and Barack Obama's red line and how they are connected, because boy, are they connected. Go get Only the Strong. Get it today. Give it to all your friends and come back for more. Back now with United States Senator Tom Cotton, talking about this magnificent book, Only the Strong. Senator, last time we were talking about the media, and I don't want to rail about the media. I do every day. I want to talk about Jimmy Carter, a great figure now in America, beloved, aging, almost 100-year-old president who people forget was an absolute catastrophe as president. He was the United States Naval Academy graduate. He's a patriot. He served. I never did. He was a submariner. I never put on the uniform. But Jimmy Carter was terrible for America. He was particularly terrible because he had a, quote, inordinate fear of communism. He didn't understand the world. How did that happen to an Academy graduate?
Well, for all of us who are too young to remember Jimmy Carter's presidency, there's a very simple solution. Just look at Joe Biden and hear him in a Southern accent. And that's what the Jimmy Carter presidency was like. Although maybe, I think Jimmy Carter actually may be the one person pleased with Joe Biden in America, because he's knocked Jimmy Carter off the list of worst modern presidents. So Jimmy Carter is no one's idea of a radical ideologue. In fact, he's the only Democrat to win the presidency in the second half of the Cold War, after Vietnam, after the Democratic left turned on America. And he won in part because he did project as a moderate, sensible Southern governor. But he staffed his administration with far left progressive ideologues, and you can see the results of it with what we get today. rampant runaway inflation, weakness abroad, Soviet Russia on the march. A very common theme, you saw it with Jimmy Carter, you've seen it with Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, and now Joe Biden as well, is the inability to distinguish between friends and foes. You know, I know your listeners, Hugh, are aware of the famous Roman general Sulla, who had engraved as an epitaph on his headstone, "No friend has done me a favor, nor enemy an injury that I've not repaid in full." Now,
it's my favorite funeral quote, yes.
Progressives would say that is crude, it's unsophisticated, it's barbarian, it's backward, and I would say it's not the only guide to American foreign policy, but you know what? It's in a dangerous world. It's not a very bad guide. You know, your listeners,
So
I know
go.
you are you're big fans of Game of Thrones. For us here in America and a few other fortunate countries in the world, Game of Thrones is a fun, distracting fantasy. For most of the world, even today, Hugh, it's called life. That's what it's like in a dangerous world. And you have blinkered
People are living and dying in Ukraine right now because of decisions we did not make in the last year. They are not defended. They are dying because of delay and dithering and idiocy in the Biden administration because of things we did not do.
And the inability to support our friends like the Somozas in Nicaragua. Now, they were nobody's idea of a good liberal Democrat, but they were pro-American, and what came next was worse. And there's a direct line to that with Barack Obama. You know, look at Barack Obama overthrowing Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, withdrawing support, which led directly to his collapse. Again, Hosni Mubarak is no one's idea of a good liberal Democrat, but he was pro-American, and what came after him was worse, and it undermined us not just in Egypt, but throughout the Middle East.
And I want to underscore here the worst part of the Carter presidency, and there were a lot of bad parts. Nicaragua was it, but it was Iran. I was sitting in San Clemente every day with Richard Nixon at the Elba of America watching on TV, and I would watch with RN, the mobs. And RN was aghast because he not only was a friend of the Shah, but he understood what Iran meant to America as one of the two twin towers of American power outside of Israel, along with Saudi Arabia in the Middle East. Jimmy Carter gave it away. And he gave it away to radical ayatollahs who are still attempting to kill Americans today on this soil because of the Donald Trump's killing of Soleimani. Iranian regimes are trying to kill your friends and my friends on American soil today. And that goes back to Jimmy Carter betraying an ally. Do Democrats not understand the consequences of betraying allies?
Well, I think the most ruthless ideologues do, and they do it on purpose, Hugh. People like Barack Obama when he withdrew support for Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, when he ran what could only be described as a partisan campaign to ostracize Israel and Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates and other opponents of his rapprochement with Iran. Because remember, these Democrats are at best deeply ambivalent about America and hostile to American power. So if you are a nation that has aligned yourself with America, you are at best suspect. Iran claims it's part of the axis of resistance. What are they resisting? They're resisting America and America's influence in the Middle East. And almost by definition, that makes them worthy of trust. Now with Iran, Barack Obama also believed that America was the source of our tensions with that country going back 43 years. He believes that we were the one who has contributed to all of the conflict between the United States and Iran, and therefore he was going to redeem America of its sins against Iran. He was going to be able to welcome them into a new embrace with America, which would also allow him to bring lower Israel and Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates and other Arab friends that we have in the region, which would allow America to withdraw from the region. Now, again, he didn't do that as a failure. He looks at the result of his foreign policy as a smashing ideological success when most Americans, just like most people throughout the world, look at the smoking ruins of that foreign policy and hang their head and weep.
Senator, I want to pause for a moment on Iran. You were the first to step up against the Iran deal and send a letter which just sent the New York Times into rage and the left into rage, saying, hey, Ayatollahs, you can sign whatever you want. It doesn't count. If you were ever to become president or advise a president on what to do about the Iran deal, I hope you will submit it to the Senate so it can be rejected and restore American constitutionalism to international order, because it was the abandonment of the treaty-making power with the Iran JCPOA which underscored how corrupt the left has become in the refusal to follow the rules. Those rules were designed by the framers to protect us from idiocy in the Oval Office. I applaud wholeheartedly in Only the Strong your diversion into this is what the JCPOA did. Do you think we can ever get back to the constitutional norm?
I do, Hugh. There's a lot of play in the joints in our Constitution. It's not illegitimate to have executive agreements between our president and the head of the state of another country, but those are almost always on minor administrative matters, things like delivery of the U.S. mails or the status of U.S. forces in a friendly nation. No president until Bill Clinton had ever thought you could have a major nuclear arms control agreement with a hostile country without Senate ratification. And that's what he did with North Korea in 1994. It didn't solve the threat of North Korea's nuclear program. 12 years later, they detonated their first weapon. But it gave a template for Barack Obama's even more reckless nuclear deal with Iran, which again didn't solve or end Iran's nuclear program. It's now much further advanced than it was when Joe Biden took office. But it did allow him to pursue his ideological ambition to enter a kind of grand rapprochement with Iran, to apologize and atone for America's sins against the Ayatollahs, and hopefully to withdraw entirely from the Middle East by elevating Iran and weakening countries like Israel and Saudi Arabia.
Now, my apologies to Bob Corker if he's listening, but he was a useful idiot in this process because some Republicans don't understand why this matters. Does our party now understand? People know I'm a Republican. Does your Senate colleague understand we have to stop acceding to the abuse of executive power and national security?
I believe so, Hugh, and as I explained in Only the Strong, the Senate has been one of the great bulwarks for American sovereignty over the years. If it wasn't for the Senate and our power to ratify treaties, we would have had Woodrow Wilson's League of Nations, which would have committed us to an insane global network of alliances, forcing us to go to war in places where we had no vital interest whatsoever. You would have had international treaties to ban the trade in arms, infringing upon Second Amendment rights. The Paris Climate Accords would have been a binding treaty that would have devastated America's energy, jobs, and driven up the price of gas and electricity even higher than they already are. So the United States Senate has always been a bulwark of common sense, reflecting the common sense of the American people against the ideological ambitions of Democratic presidents.
When we come back tomorrow, the red line. In the meantime, go and get Only the Strong. You will be happy you did. Send it to everyone. And remember, when you vote this week and next week, if you're voting early, vote Republican. We are in a dangerous time, and we have to get the Republican majorities back. Thank you, Senator. We'll talk again. Which segment is this, Adam? Day 4, part 7. Okay, first part of day 4. Welcome back, America. Hugh Hewitt back with Senator Tom Cotton. We have been talking all week about Only the Strong, and I'm doing that in the course of an election week, and people are writing me emails of, why are you spending so much time? He's not on the ballot. And it's because actually he is on the ballot. Everyone's on the ballot. Our future's on the ballot. Senator, the red line. You spend a lot of time on the red line. I want you to explain what it is, why it matters, why you did, and how it crippled us and it continues to haunt us.
Well, let me take a step back to the context of the red line, Hugh. As I explained in Only the Strong, Barack Obama seemed to have a kind of a confused, ad hoc, improvisational approach to the so-called Arab Spring, when Arab peoples across the Middle East and North Africa rose up, many times making justified demands against repressive governments. But if you look for a coherent theme in his response, it's actually pretty simple to find. If you were pro-American, which Egypt was, which Libya by 2011 de facto was, then you got toppled and overthrown. If you were anti-American, like Bashar al-Assad in Syria, and pro-Iran, then you were appeased and coddled. So Obama went, even after he withdrew support for Hosni Mubarak in Egypt and Muammar Gaddafi in Libya within days, he went months without saying anything about Assad in Syria. Finally, he was shamed into taking some rhetorical action at least, and he drew what he called a red line if chemical weapons were used in Syria in 2012, the height of the campaign. And about a year later, in my first months in Congress, that's exactly what happened in the summer of 2013. And at that point, he had to enforce his red line. You may not agree with the red line. You may think that it was unwise to draw. I personally think that presidents should very, very sparingly do things like draw red lines. But once they're drawn, they have to be enforced ruthlessly. As Bob Gates said, he always recommended presidents not draw red lines. But once you cock the weapon, you have to fire it when someone crosses the red line. And Obama didn't. He didn't launch the exact kind of airstrikes into Syria that he had done to Libya just a couple years earlier without congressional authorization. He was looking for someone to blame and to bail him out because he was still pursuing his grand ideological plan with Iran, and he didn't want to strike Bashar al-Assad, Iran's client in Syria. So he called Congress back into session. He asked Vladimir Putin to bail him out. Vladimir Putin gave him a fig leaf saying that he was going to remove Syria's chemical weapons, and then he withdrew the resolution from Congress. And he thought that was a big victory. It was an absolute strategic catastrophe. I can't tell you how many leaders, not just from the Arab world, but all around the world, cited the Red Line fiasco for years to me as because it so deeply undermined American credibility. And as I explained in Only the Strong, you can have the world's strongest military. You can have a deep and abiding set of alliances with friendly nations. But if the American president's word is not credible, America is at risk.
You know, I want you to expand on this because there are many memorable anecdotes in Only the Strong. The one which has probably already made headlines, and maybe it's been figured out by many people who read it. An Arab head of state managed to arrange for you to meet them at a different place than where you were supposed to be so that the Obama ambassador would be cut out and they could speak candidly to you. How often do you think that happened across the world where people looked at each other and said, we cannot count on America anymore? I mean, I just think it must have happened everywhere.
Yeah, it's quite a scene. I mean, we did, you know, when you travel overseas as a senator, you don't necessarily expect to meet with the head of state. You meet with our people on our embassies. Sometimes you meet with cabinet ministers. Sometimes you meet with the head of state. Sometimes you don't. We did not plan to on this trip, but we had a last-minute request. This ruler offered to send his very nice helicopter to fly us, and at the last minute, as I write in Only the Strong, changed the meeting location, and for about 45 minutes excoriated President Obama and the Red Line. And then our ambassador came in, rushing, disheveled, apologizing. She didn't know that the location had changed. And I realized that he had done that on purpose because for the next 45 minutes, he was the picture of diplomacy and tact, very thankful for everything the Obama administration had done to help his nation. But
you know why that matters? That's the way the world works. They don't tell reporters what they really think. What they really think is what they see and what it means for their country. I think Only the Strong's great strength is that it's a real look at how rulers really react, and we've got to start thinking this way. I want to move very quickly to President Trump. There's a lot of interesting stuff about President Trump's foreign policy. When he decided to kill Soleimani, did he do the right thing?
No question, Hugh. We should have done it long before. I mean, just to give you a contrast between the perception of American power during the Trump era versus the Obama era. In the Obama era, Qasem Soleimani had long since abandoned the operational security measures he took during the Bush era. He was a social media phenomenon when Barack Obama was president, posting selfies and videos of himself across the Middle East. He did that because he was confident that he would never be killed by death from the sky. Donald Trump, corrected that misimpression of his. He was a terrorist mastermind. It's hard to overstate his influence inside Iran, probably second only to the supreme leader. He was in charge of an organization that would be akin to combining our Delta Force and our Navy SEALs and our CIA and our NSA. It made Americans a lot safer. And there were cries from both the left and even some on the right that this was going to lead to another endless war. We're going to invade Iran, that we're at war with Iran. It didn't lead to that. It increased our safety because Iran was not foolish enough to go to war with America when we were led by a president who had a clear-eyed view of our interests. As I explained in Only the Strong, the same thing happened under Ronald Reagan. When Iran was mining the Persian Gulf and shooting missiles at oil tankers during the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, the first message that President Reagan sent to them was blowing up one of their platforms that had been used for intelligence collection on a missile that had struck a U.S. flagged ship. And a reporter
I'm so proud of that chapter, by the way. I'm just, as a Reagan administration alum, I was over at OPM at the time. I'd left the White House. But you really gave Reagan his credit for taking out the Iran. I mean, it was beautifully done. Praying Mantis, is that the name of the operation?
Yeah,
It just was.
and a reporter asked Ronald Reagan after that first strike, "Are we at war with Iran now?" And he chuckled in his way and said, "No, we're not at war with Iran. They're not that stupid."
When we come back with Senator Cotton, we're going to turn to the immediate needs of the country. There's a long argument in Only the Strong about how we rebuild, what we rebuild with the American military. Can we do Reagan a second time? I think so. Senator Cotton has a blueprint. If you want to read it in detail, I can't summarize it on our radio show. Go get Only the Strong. Be back. Stay tuned. This number 8, Adam? All right. Welcome back, America. Senator Tom Cotton is back with me. Throughout this week of election coverage, I've been weaving in my interview with Senator Cotton about his brand new book, Only the Strong, and urging you to go out and get it, because when we win the majority, and we meaning the Republican Party, we got to use it. And Senator, you spend a lot of time talking about military readiness. Is it possible to undo the damage of Obama and Biden? And by that I mean, Bob Gates got fooled. Bob Gates is not easily fooled. Bob Gates is one of the smartest guys in America. He got fooled by Obama's promise. We are left with a hollowed-out military. Ronald Reagan inherited the same thing. Can a Republican Congress repair this?
Yeah, no, there's no question, Hugh, that we can begin the repair work. Now, ultimately, it's going to take a new president, a new Secretary of Defense dedicated to rebuilding our military. We had a small temporary blip in military spending increase in the Trump era, but that was largely just to fill the holes under the Obama era, which had brought our military down to dangerously low levels of readiness. So the first thing we need to do is simply increase our defense budget substantially, increase it substantially over the high rate of inflation we have now. We are getting closer to where we were spending our defense budgets where we were in the Carter era than we have been at any other time. The second thing we have to do is make sure that we're investing in the right things. I've seen too many politicians in Congress and frankly, too many admirals and generals who are convinced, in the latest kind of whiz-bang technology, and suddenly war is going to be won with hashtags and keystrokes. Don't get me wrong, technology is very important, but it's battlefield technology that makes the difference. Battlefield technology in the hands of soldiers, or that sailors can take across the seas, or that airmen can fly into battle. So we have to invest in the right things. One thing we really have to invest on that we've talked about a few times this week is increasing the rate of productions for our munitions. These are not stealth aircraft, they're not aircraft carriers. They can be built in relatively short time frames if we give our defense industry the certainty and the funding it needs to increase its production rates. These are all steps that we need to take to give the military the resources it needs, but we also have to focus on the training. Democrats are deeply ambivalent about American power, which means they're mistrustful, as I explained in Only the Strong, about the American military, because the military is American power at its hardest edge. It's not the only kind of power. It's not the kind of power we prefer to use if we can help it, but it's the hardest form of American power. And that's why Democrats are making our troops go through these Maoist struggle sessions about critical race theory or transgender ideology, while they have so many politically correct pursuits that they impose on our troops. They engage in social engineering throughout the ranks. All that can be turned around, though, with a new president and a new Secretary of Defense.
Senator, you're always more clear-eyed than I am and a little more hard-edged than I am. I always put it down to Democrats doing the easy thing. They'd rather not kill people, so that let's train them on gender diversity. They'd rather not get into an argument. But there's also the Roman Catholic doctrine of invincible ignorance, which is you can't condemn people because they're too stupid about something. When I see Ben Rhodes show up at Fidel Castro's funeral, I realize he really doesn't have any idea what Castro did to people, or he's indifferent to human pain and suffering. When I see Joe Biden talking about the evils around the world that can be overcome by cheerleading, I just don't think they understand. Am I being too generous? Do they understand and don't care, or do they not understand?
I think, again, it gets back to some of the philosophical and ideological roots of American decline on the left that we discussed earlier this week. If you reject America's founding and the moral basis of our country, if you think that human nature is somehow changeable, that it can be perfected, that we can achieve heaven on earth, that we can return to the garden this side of heaven, then you are easily duped by ruthless, bloodthirsty dictators like Xi Jinping or Fidel Castro or the Ayatollahs. If you add on to that the deep ambivalence about America, open hostility to American power that the New Left gave to us in the 1960s and 1970s, you get what you just described. Democrats who fall prey to especially left-wing dictators. Remember, it's never pro-American, right-wing strongmen. It's always left-wing, anti-American dictators. And they, in effect, simply surrender to them. Look at Barack Obama's deal with Cuba. It was actually worse than the deal with Iran. I mean, if you just read the terms of it, you would have thought that Cuba had defeated us in a war because we got absolutely nothing in return. We gave them everything. But that gets back to the ideological roots of the Democratic Party and their views about American power.
Now, this segment, we got 3 minutes. I want to talk about the American military. We'll come back and wrap this up about going forward in China. The American military is captained by very brave people. They've often served in combat, but they are all very political. And I regularly get missives from retired general officers. And people know, full disclosure, I have a son, son-in-law, and nephew on active duty. None of them are general officers. I'm not talking about them. I get regular emails from retired general officers who say that the senior ranks of the military has become too politicized. Do you believe that? How do we fix it?
I believe in some cases it has. I don't want to paint with a broad brush and say it's everyone, but in some cases it has. Sometimes you have senior military leaders who are trying to appeal to shifting political winds, and they believe that's what they need to advance in the Biden administration. Or they see the permanent bureaucracy in the Pentagon, which needs to be badly pared back, like most places, tends to lean to the left. But again, the military, thankfully, is different from any other bureaucracy in our government. There is a chain of command. There is a uniform code of military justice, and you can impose certain standards down to the front lines. You know, I write in Only the Strong how we went through various kinds of training, non-tactical training, once every 6 months, once a year, things like motorcycle safety or smoking cessation. Part of that was equal opportunity training as well. And back in those days, 15 years ago, it was simply reminding our troops that we have a zero tolerance policy for racial or sexual discrimination or harassment of any kind. That's what we need to get back to. A new Secretary of Defense can say that. In fact, he could write his own PowerPoint slide and say, this is the new EO policy guidance for the military. It will be briefed down to troops once every 6 months, once every 12 months. Any command that uses something different will have the commander relieved immediately. If that were to happen to you, I bet you wouldn't have any more critical race theory sessions in our military. And if you did, there'd be consequences immediately.
From your lips to the next SecDef's ears. Don't go anywhere, America. When we come back, we're going to talk about China with Senator Cotton on the next segment of the Only the Strong series. Get out and vote. Boy, we are at the break. Okay, Adam, which segment is this? Okay, we have 2 more parts, Senator, so we're going to go whole China here. 3, 2, 1. Back from my last 2 conversations this hour next with Senator Cotton about the book, which is a bestseller, and people's eyebrows have arched up in the middle of a campaign, Only the Strong. How is a serious argument being made about national security in the middle of an argument? While inflation rages, the crime wave crescendos, the border is open. No one is talking about China except you and me. Why should we be talking about China? Why have you spent so much time in Only the Strong talking about China, Tom Cotton?
Well, Hugh, in many places I've campaigned over the last month, there is actually conversation about China because Americans recognize that China is not just a threat to our safety and freedom and independence, but it's a threat to our prosperity. So many Americans have lost their jobs to China. So many industries and businesses have been cheated by China. China is the #1 threat the United States faces. It's probably, in many ways, a more dangerous threat than Soviet Russia was because of our economic entanglement with China. It was a terrible mistake, a terrible historic strategic mistake to aid China's rise. China was and has been, since 1949, a communist nation. And simply because they began to apply market principles in aid of their own development to build their own national power, we should never have been duped in the 1990s and the 2000s that China's rise was somehow going to be peaceful and beneficial for America. If you look carefully, you could see the signs of how China itself repudiated that idea. But certainly by the time Barack Obama took office, we should have been under no illusion that China viewed itself in a competition with America. And now Joe Biden still won't even say that we're in some kind of Cold War with China. Now, he may not want that. He refused to say in the 1980s we're in a Cold War with Soviet Russia as well. But, you don't really get to make that choice. If a nation like China is waging a Cold War against you, threatening your interests, undermining your friends, stealing from your workers, from your businesses, costing jobs, costing trillions of dollars of economic growth here in America, the only choice you have is to win or to lose.
Now, Senator, you are on the Intelligence Committee and the Judiciary Committee. So you're in a position to talk to Christopher Wray in two forums. Last week, he announced that they are opening a new counterintelligence investigation against a Chinese agent in the United States every single day. The breadth and scope and depth of the China challenge to subvert and undermine American interests and to spy on us is so overwhelming. I don't know if we can recover from this. And only the strong, you allude to it. What do you do as a Republican majority? Nothing's going to get done, by the way, if we elect Democrats. Nothing at all. They don't seem to care about this. But do you think Wray and the gang can get on top of this?
Well, I think we should be spending a lot more of the FBI's time and resources focused on Chinese espionage and less on so-called threats to democracy or other fleeting fears of the Democratic Party they see behind every door. The FBI should not be used as the enforcement arm of Joe Biden's Democratic Party. It should be used to protect Americans. And one key threat is Chinese espionage. I mean, as you say, Hugh, it's pervasive. We have in Arkansas cases, judicial cases, where Chinese nationals or American citizens have been charged with stealing valuable technology that we could use here for our own prosperity as opposed to letting it be taken back to China. So although the FBI has a lot of dedicated agents who are working on the China threat, we really need even more, and we need to be more clear-eyed about how pervasive that threat is. Even when it's not espionage, China has a vast influence operation in the United States. I mean, look at the way LeBron James responded when the Houston Rockets general manager showed some support for Hong Kong protesters. Look at Disney sucking up to the Chinese provincial government that's responsible for enslaving religious and ethnic minorities in China. It's pervasive throughout the media, Hollywood, Silicon Valley, universities and colleges, lobbies in Washington, and it needs to be exposed so the American people realize the extent of the threat that China poses.
Last question for this segment on China, Senator. People have to read Only the Strong if they want to get the full scope of it. There will be a next president. That next president will be dealing with President Xi, who's dictator for life. There will be a first conversation between our next president and President Xi. What do you want our next president to say in that first conversation with Xi?
Well, he needs to make clear that there's going to be a major correction from the Biden era and the Obama era, that we're no longer going to allow China to exploit our workers and our businesses. We're not going to allow them to threaten our friends in the Western Pacific, like Japan and South Korea and Taiwan, and that under no circumstances will we stand by if Xi Jinping tries to go for the jugular in Taiwan. That should be said publicly. Unlike Joe Biden, it shouldn't be walked back by anonymous aides afterwards. But then actions speak louder than words. That next president has to take emergency action to ensure that Taiwan can fortify itself and it can do to China what Ukraine, with American and Western help, has been able to do to Russia, which is defend its own territory and fight its own war against a large, dangerous neighbor.
We'll come back. One more conversation with Senator Cotton about Only the Strong. Don't miss it next hour. Welcome back. I'm with Senator Tom Cotton, his book, Only the Strong. I hope you've enjoyed, I know you've enjoyed the conversations with him, but I've only skimmed along the surface of Only the Strong. You have to read Only the Strong if you're going to enjoy Only the Strong. Senator, I left at the end one question. Do you think a serious argument will work? Abraham Lincoln went to Cooper Union and he tried to make a serious argument about why slavery was never the intention of the framers, why it could not be extended to territory. It was a long speech. It was electrified. It made his presidency viable. It made him a candidate. It was a serious argument, but it was a serious time and people used to read. Do you think serious arguments work in an era of Twitter and MSNBC?
Yeah, I do, Hugh. For the record, I think Abraham Lincoln would also have been great on Twitter and on social media because he was so pithy and witty. I mean, remember the
True.
Gettysburg Address could probably fit in a few tweets. But we've been down this road before. In the years after Vietnam and the Jimmy Carter presidency, many of the fears that Americans have today, they had then as well. Not all of this history gets into Only the Strong, but I read deeply about that era and about Ronald Reagan and how rapidly he turned America around. So by winning this election on Tuesday, and then by winning again in 2024, and having a new president with new Secretary of Defense and a new Secretary of State, committed leaders who believe in America, who are proud of our country and its heritage, and hopeful and optimistic about our future, then we can turn it around, as I explain in Only the Strong. And that's what the American people want. It's what they expect and they deserve. They deserve leaders who attend to their interests, who ensure their safety and their freedom and their prosperity, who don't apologize for America, who don't undermine the sources of American power. If one makes that argument, I think the American people will receive it very well.
Senator Cotton, in Alexander Solzhenitsyn's memoir, The Oak and the Calf, he said, what if it's only paper mache? He was referring to the then Soviet Union. He was referring to the superpower that no one thought would ever fall when it came out probably in the early 80s. Oak and the Calf. What if it's all paper mache? What if it will melt in the rain? Do you think we can actually pull this off again? I know you hope we can, but do you really think a second Reagan can arrive and a second renewal following catastrophic foreign policy failure can occur?
I absolutely do, Hugh. I draw upon Reagan's wisdom a lot in Only the Strong because he drew upon the founders' wisdom. Their foreign policy looks different because of different circumstances and ages, but at root it still was based in pride about our nation and understanding of the way the world works and a dedication to our safety and our freedom and our prosperity. The American people still want that. I also draw a lot upon Winston Churchill as well.
Yes.
And he had a nice line, I said, about the character of our people. We did not journey all this way. We did not come across the ages, cross the oceans, and cross the mountains and the plains because we're made of sugar candy. The American people are not made of sugar candy. They are not paper mache. Many people have met their demise over the last 250 years by underestimating the American people. And I would caution any of our adversaries, Joe Biden's weakness or Barack Obama's ideological weakness is not the weakness of the American people.
Senator Tom Cotton, thank you. Congratulations on Only the Strong, available at Amazon, bookstores everywhere. Make sure you get it in the hands of everyone and vote like your life depended on it next Tuesday because, as Senator Cotton explains in Only the Strong, indeed it does. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Hugh.